He thought humiliating her would entertain his guests, but he had no idea he had just invited his own downfall as the golden lights of Brooks and Crown reflected off polished marble floors and crystal glasses, and the low hum of wealthy conversation filled the air like a soft orchestra. Chef Daniel Brooks stood at the center of it all, confident, admired, untouchable, his tailored jacket crisp, his voice sharp as he commanded a kitchen that moved at his rhythm. Every plate a performance, every guest an audience. And then there was Claire Whitman, barely noticed near the back, her quiet figure blending into the stainless steel shadows, sleeves rolled, hands damp from hours at the sink. Her presence so small, it almost felt intentional, like she preferred it that way, like invisibility was a shield she had chosen, not one forced upon her. But tonight was different. Tonight the restaurant hosted a private dinner for high-profile investors and one particularly feared food critic whose single review could elevate or destroy careers overnight, and Daniel knew it. He thrived on it. He fed off pressure like fuel, his voice rising slightly louder, his gestures more dramatic, his arrogance just a shade more visible. And as laughter rolled from the VIP table, he turned, scanning the kitchen, his eyes landing on Claire with a smirk that carried both boredom and opportunity. "Hey," he called out, his tone slicing through the room. "You, Claire, right?" The staff paused, a few glances exchanged, subtle, knowing, the kind that predicted what was about to happen. She looked up slowly, her expression calm, almost unreadable. "Yes, chef." Her voice soft but steady, and that was all it took. The smallest opening. Daniel stepped closer, wiping his hands with deliberate flair. "Why don't you cook something for our guests?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "just for fun." And a ripple of laughter followed. Light at first, then growing, phones subtly raised, curiosity, mixing with amusement, the kind of moment people loved to capture. A harmless joke, or so they thought. The air shifted, barely noticeable, but real, like a subtle drop in temperature before a storm. Claire didn't react immediately. She didn't defend herself, didn't shrink either. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and for a brief second, something in that stillness felt out of place, like silence in the middle of chaos. Daniel chuckled, mistaking it for hesitation. "What? Too much?" he added, the sarcasm drawing more smiles. But then she nodded, just once. "One dish," she said quietly, and something about the way she said it made the nearest line cook glance up, just for a moment, as if a memory had brushed past him. The kitchen fell into a strange rhythm, movements slowing as attention shifted toward her. Claire stepped forward, washing her hands with precise, deliberate motions, water running, droplets catching the light, every movement controlled, almost practiced beyond what her role suggested. She reached for a knife, not hesitantly, but with familiarity, the kind that doesn't come from watching, but from doing, over and over. The chatter in the dining room softened, curiosity replacing mockery. The critic leaned slightly forward, sensing something he couldn't yet explain, and Daniel, still smiling, folded his arms, waiting for the inevitable awkwardness, the expected failure that would reinforce everything he believed. But then Claire began, and the room, without realizing it, started to listen. The first sound was not dramatic, not loud, but precise. The clean rhythm of a blade meeting a cutting board, steady, controlled, almost measured like a metronome. And it carried through the kitchen in a way that slowly pulled attention away from conversations and towards something quieter but far more deliberate. Claire Whitman moved without hesitation, selecting ingredients not randomly but with intention, her eyes scanning, calculating, dismissing options within seconds as if she already knew the outcome before the process had even begun. A junior cook nearby paused mid-motion, watching her choose a cut of fish that had been reserved for the evening's highest-paying guest, his mouth parting slightly in confusion. But before he could speak, she had already begun, her knife gliding through the flesh with a smoothness that felt almost effortless. Each slice identical in thickness, each motion economical, no wasted movement, no second-guessing. And the longer she worked, the quieter the kitchen became, the laughter from moments ago fading into something more uncertain, something that did not quite have a name yet. Chef Daniel Brooks remained near the pass, arms still crossed, but his smile had tightened just enough to reveal a flicker of attention. Because this was not what he expected, not the clumsy uncertainty, not the nervous fumbling. Instead, there was control, and control in a kitchen like this meant something. It meant experience, it meant training, and it meant a level of discipline that did not belong to someone who spent hours behind a sink. Claire reached for a pan, heating it with precise timing, not rushing, not hesitating, the oil shimmering at exactly the right moment before she placed the fish down. The soft sear filling the air with a sound that made several heads turn instinctively, even out in the dining room. The aroma followed seconds later, subtle but layered, drawing the attention of the critic who had been mid-conversation, his fork pausing just inches from his plate, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned his head toward the kitchen. Something about that scent did not match the narrative he had just witnessed. Something about it spoke of balance, restraint, intention. Inside, Claire continued, her movements now almost invisible in their efficiency, seasoning with a light touch, adjusting heat by instinct. Her posture relaxed but focused, like someone who had done this not hundreds but thousands of times. A server near the doorway whispered to another, asking quietly who she was, but no one answered, because no one truly knew, and that silence carried its own weight. Daniel stepped closer now, just one step, enough to see the details more clearly, his eyes tracing her technique, searching for flaws, for hesitation, for anything that would confirm his assumption. But there was none. Instead, he found familiarity, something uncomfortably close to recognition, but he pushed it aside, his voice breaking the quiet with forced casualness. "Not bad," he said, though it came out flatter than intended. Claire did not respond. She simply plated the dish, and that was when the final shift happened. The room, the energy, the expectation, everything seemed to lean toward that single plate as she arranged each component with deliberate precision, not overdone, not showy, but exact, the kind of presentation that did not demand attention yet commanded it anyway. A hush settled over the nearest staff, one of them instinctively stepping back as if giving space to something they did not fully understand. Claire wiped the edge of the plate clean, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, and then she lifted it, turning toward the dining room. And in that moment, the quiet felt louder than any laughter that had come before. She did not rush as she stepped out of the kitchen, the plate balanced in her hands with a steadiness that seemed almost detached from the tension surrounding her. The soft glow of the dining room lights catching the delicate arrangement as if it had always belonged there, not as a joke, not as a spectacle, but as something intentional, something real. Conversation slowed, then faded entirely as she approached the table where the critic sat, his eyes fixed on the dish long before it reached him. The faint aroma arriving first, layered, precise, something that did not try to impress yet demanded to be understood. And for the first time that evening, no one laughed, no one whispered. They simply watched. Daniel remained near the kitchen entrance, his posture still confident, but no longer relaxed, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it, as if some part of him needed to be closer, needed to see this through. Claire placed the plate gently in front of the critic, her movements quiet, respectful, without flourish, and then she stepped back, not seeking approval, not explaining, just waiting. The critic did not speak immediately. He studied the dish first, his gaze moving across each element with the practiced eye of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by very little. His fingers adjusted his utensils slowly, deliberately, as if buying time, as if something about this moment required more care than usual. The room held its breath, a silence so complete it seemed to absorb every small sound. The faint clink of silverware, the distant hum of refrigeration from the kitchen, even the subtle shift of a chair became noticeable, and then he took the first bite. The reaction was not immediate, and that made it worse, because anticipation stretched, thick and heavy, his expression unreadable for a second, then another, until suddenly he stopped mid-motion, his fork hovering in the air, his eyes narrowing not in criticism but in recognition. Something clicked, something deeper than taste, deeper than technique. He set the fork down slowly, too slowly, and leaned back just slightly, his gaze lifting from the plate to Claire, studying her now with a different kind of attention, one that replaced curiosity with certainty. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and it sent a ripple through the room. Daniel felt it before he understood it. a tightening in his chest, a flicker of unease he could not immediately explain. The critic stood up, not abruptly, but with a controlled movement that drew every eye in the room. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than expected, almost careful. "This technique," he said, pausing as if choosing each word with precision. "This balance, this restraint." Another pause, longer this time, the kind that builds pressure rather than releases it. He looked directly at her now, no longer at the dish, and in that moment, the power in the room shifted. Completely. "I have only tasted this once before," he continued, the silence tightening around his words. "Years ago." A murmur began somewhere at the edge of the room but quickly died as his next words approached. Daniel took a step forward, almost instinctively, as if trying to intercept something he could not yet see, but it was already too late. The critic's eyes did not leave Claire's face as recognition settled fully into place. Unmistakable now, undeniable. "Claire Whitman," he said, quietly, and the name landed in the room like a revelation, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And for the first time that night, it was not Claire who stood in the spotlight. It was Daniel, frozen where he stood, the confidence in his expression slipping just enough to reveal something beneath it, something fragile, something unprepared, because in that single moment, everything he thought he knew about the woman he had mocked no longer made sense, and the room, once filled with laughter, now waited in complete silence for what would happen next. The name did not echo loudly, yet it filled the room with a weight no one could ignore. Claire Whitman. The syllables lingered in the air as if they carried history, reputation, something far beyond the quiet woman standing in a worn apron. The critic remained still, his gaze steady, almost respectful now, and that single shift in tone was enough to unsettle every assumption that had been made just minutes earlier. A few guests exchanged glances, confusion turning into curiosity, phones lowered, smiles fading, because this was no longer entertainment. This was something else entirely, something they had not been prepared for. Daniel felt the change before anyone spoke again. The energy had moved away from him, away from his control, and settled around her. His jaw tightened slightly, his mind searching for something to hold on to, a reason, an explanation that would restore the balance he had just lost. But nothing came. The critic took a slow step closer, his voice calm but unmistakably certain. "You trained in Lion," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. And Claire did not immediately respond. Her expression remained composed, her eyes steady, as if this moment was not unexpected, as if she had already lived through something far more difficult than this room. A faint murmur spread through the guests. Lion meant something, even to those who did not fully understand it. It meant legacy, precision, a level of discipline that few ever reached. Daniel let out a quiet laugh, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "Come on," he said, his tone attempting lightness but failing to carry it. "That is a stretch." But even as he spoke, he did not sound convinced, because somewhere deep beneath his denial, recognition had already begun to take shape. Small, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. The critic did not look at him. His focus remained entirely on Claire. "I reviewed a restaurant there 8 years ago," he continued, his voice drawing the room in. "A place that did not advertise, did not chase attention, but every dish was flawless, every detail intentional." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalling something precise. The chef never came out to greet anyone. Another pause, longer this time. But the work spoke for itself. Claire's hands remained still at her sides, her posture unchanged, yet something in the silence around her deepened. Daniel took another step forward now, closer than before, his voice quieter. "That restaurant closed," he said quickly, as if clinging to the fact. There was nothing special about it. But the words sounded hollow even to him. The critic finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "It did not close because it lacked excellence," he replied evenly. "It closed because its chef walked away." The words settled into the room with quiet force, and now all eyes returned to Claire, not with amusement, not with doubt, but with something closer to realization. Daniel's expression shifted again, the confidence draining further, replaced by something sharper, more defensive. "Even if that were true," he said, his voice tightening, That does not mean anything here. But the statement felt smaller than the moment, because everything in the room already contradicted him. The dish on the table, the silence of the guests, the presence of the critic, all of it pointed in one direction. Claire finally moved, just slightly, lifting her gaze to meet the critic's eyes. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "It was a long time ago," she said. And that was all. No explanation, no justification, just a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than any defense could have. The critic nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed everything he needed to know. And the room, once filled with laughter at her expense, now held something entirely different, a quiet respect that had not been offered before. And in that silence, Daniel stood still, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one in control, because the story he thought he was directing had already moved beyond him. And he could feel it slipping further with every second that passed. No one spoke for a moment after her words settled. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that could be said suddenly felt insufficient. The air carried a different weight now, heavier, more deliberate, as if the room itself had shifted its allegiance without asking permission. Daniel stood there, still close enough to hear every whisper, every subtle intake of breath, and for the first time that evening, he was not being watched with admiration, but with expectation, the kind that demanded an answer he did not yet have. He straightened slightly, forcing a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Well," he began, his voice measured, attempting to regain rhythm. "A past in cooking does not define what happens in this kitchen." But even as the words left him, they lacked the authority they once carried, because authority had quietly changed hands. The critic did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for another bite, slower this time, more intentional, as if confirming something already decided. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet certainty that cut deeper than any raised voice could have. "What happens in this kitchen," he said, glancing briefly around the room, "is defined by discipline, respect, and understanding." His gaze returned to Daniel, steady, unwavering, not by volume. A faint shift moved through the guests, subtle, but undeniable, a realignment of perception. Daniel's expression tightened, just enough to reveal the pressure building beneath the surface. He stepped closer to the table, his posture still upright, but his movements less fluid than before. "This is my restaurant," he said, more firmly now, as if grounding himself in something tangible, "and I decide what defines it." The statement hung in the air, bold, but no longer absolute, because the room had already begun to question it. Claire remained where she stood, neither retreating nor advancing, her presence quiet yet impossible to ignore, and that contrast, her stillness against his rising tension, only made the shift more visible. One of the guests, a man who had been observing quietly from the edge of the table, leaned forward slightly, his voice careful but curious. "If she is who you think she is," he said, addressing the critic, "why is she here?" The question did not carry judgment, only genuine confusion, and it echoed the unspoken thought in every mind present. The critic paused, considering, then glanced at Claire again. But this time, there was something else in his expression, not just recognition, but respect. "Some people," he replied slowly, "walk away from recognition when they realize it is no longer aligned with who they are." The answer did not fully explain, but it did not need to, because it shifted the focus from what she had been to what she had chosen. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, though it sounded thinner now. "Or perhaps," he said, attempting to reclaim ground, "they simply could not maintain it." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction, because every detail in front of him contradicted that possibility. The dish, the technique, the reaction of the critic, none of it aligned with failure. The critic's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel, not with hostility, but with something quieter, something closer to disappointment. "Excellence," he said calmly, "does not disappear." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that settled over the room like a closing note. And in that moment, the dynamic was no longer subtle. It was clear, undeniable. Daniel was no longer the one setting the tone, and he knew it. Even if he refused to fully accept it, Claire finally moved again, stepping back slightly, as if preparing to return to the place she had come from. not out of defeat, but out of choice, as if the moment had already served its purpose for her. But the room was not ready to let it end, not yet, because something had been revealed that could not simply be ignored. And as the silence stretched once more, it was no longer empty. It was filled with a single, pressing question that lingered in every mind. What happens when the person you dismiss turns out to be the one who defines the standard you thought you owned? The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like tension releasing thread by thread, but no one moved to fill it with laughter again, because that version of the room no longer existed. Daniel stood at the center of it, still, composed on the surface, but the subtle shifts betrayed him. The way his fingers flexed once at his side, the way his eyes moved more than necessary, searching for something to stabilize the moment, something to return him to the position he had occupied so effortlessly before. But control, once lost in a room like this, did not return easily, especially not when every gaze had already turned elsewhere. Claire had begun to step back toward the kitchen, her movements quiet, almost as if she intended to disappear into the same background she had emerged from. But the critic's voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, but firm in a way that carried weight. "Why did you leave?" he asked, and the question landed differently than the others. It was not about technique, not about status. It was about choice, and for a moment, even the staff leaned in slightly, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Claire paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter behind her, her posture still composed, and when she turned back, her expression had not changed, but there was something quieter beneath it now, something reflective, because it stopped being about the work. She said simply, her voice steady, the answer short, but it carried a clarity that needed no expansion. The critic nodded slowly, as if that was the only explanation that mattered, but Daniel stepped forward again, unable to remain silent any longer. "And now," he said, his tone tighter, controlled but edged, "you wash dishes." It was not a question, it was an attempt to reduce, to simplify, to bring her back into a category he understood, because categories were easier to control than uncertainty. Claire met his gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. "Now I choose what I do," she replied, and the distinction was subtle but powerful. It shifted the narrative from circumstance to intention, from limitation to control, and that difference settled into the room with quiet authority. One of the guests exhaled softly, almost involuntarily, as if something unspoken had just been confirmed. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came immediately, because there was nothing in that answer he could easily dismiss. The critic stepped back slightly, giving space, but his presence still anchored the moment. "You understand something many forget," he said, his tone thoughtful, "that excellence without purpose becomes performance." The words hung in the air, and this time, they did not challenge, they revealed. They drew a line between what the room had witnessed before and what it had just experienced. Daniel felt it, the comparison, the implication, even if it was not spoken directly. And for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick remark, no effortless recovery, just a pause, longer than any he had allowed himself that night. The staff near the kitchen entrance stood unusually still, their usual movements suspended as they watched the exchange unfold, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in how they saw Claire, but in how they saw him. Claire glanced briefly toward the sink, toward the place where she had started the evening, and then back at the room, her expression calm, unchanged, as if nothing here had altered her sense of self. She did not seek recognition, did not step further into the spotlight. She simply existed within it without needing to hold it, and that, more than anything else, made it impossible to ignore her presence. Daniel finally spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter, not weakened, but measured, as if choosing words carried more risk now. "This kitchen runs on standards," he said, though the statement felt less like authority and more like an attempt to define something slipping away. Claire nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in the statement without surrendering to it. "It should," she said, and then, after a brief pause, that held just enough weight to be felt, she added, "But standards are not owned." And the room, once again, fell into silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had been said could not be undone. And in that stillness, Daniel stood facing a reality he had not prepared for, one where the person he had dismissed was no longer just present, but quietly redefining everything around him. The words did not fade when she finished speaking. They lingered, suspended in the air like something the room was still trying to fully understand. Standards are not owned. The statement echoed silently through every corner of the restaurant, through polished glass, through marble reflections, through the carefully constructed identity Daniel had built around himself. And for a moment, no one moved, because movement would have meant choosing a side, and no one was ready to do that just yet. Daniel inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes before a decision, before a shift. His eyes locked onto Claire now with a focus that was no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but something sharper, something more deliberate. "Then show me," he said, his voice quieter than before but carrying a new edge, not mockery this time, but challenge. And that single phrase changed the rhythm of the room again. The staff exchanged glances, subtle but charged, because this was no longer a joke. This was something else entirely. Claire did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, unreadable, as if measuring not the request, but the intention behind it. The critic remained silent, watching closely, understanding the shift for what it was. This was no longer about proving a point to an audience. This was something more personal, more direct, a confrontation not of volume, but of substance. Daniel stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between authority and uncertainty. "You said standards are not owned," he continued, his tone controlled. "So show me what that means." The challenge was clear now, but it lacked the arrogance it once would have carried, because somewhere beneath it, there was something else, something quieter, something closer to doubt. Claire glanced briefly toward the kitchen, toward the space that had become both her cover and her canvas, and then back at him. The room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of anticipation for spectacle, but for something more precise, more revealing. She nodded once, a small movement, but it carried weight, and without another word, she turned and walked back into the kitchen. The shift was immediate. The staff straightened, not out of command, but instinct, as if recognizing a different kind of presence now, one that did not need to demand attention to receive it. Claire moved through the space with quiet authority, not claiming it, but understanding it, her hands returning to the rhythm that had already begun to change everything. Daniel followed, not directly beside her, but close enough to observe, his usual distance gone, replaced by something more involved, more personal. The critic remained at the table, but his attention did not waver. Every detail mattered now. Every movement carried meaning. Claire reached the station and paused for a brief moment, her fingers resting lightly on the counter. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not in the room, but within the moment itself, because this was no longer about responding to a challenge. It was about defining something deeper, something that could not be reduced to a single dish or a single reaction. She began again. But this time, the difference was unmistakable, not in the technique, but in the intention. Each movement carried a clarity that did not seek validation. It simply existed, undeniable. The staff watched in silence, not out of curiosity now, but respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. Daniel's eyes followed every motion, searching, learning, confronting something he had not expected to face. And for the first time, he was not looking for flaws. He was looking for understanding. And that shift, more than anything else, marked the moment where control no longer defined him. Because what stood in front of him was not something he could command, only something he could witness. And as the kitchen settled into this new rhythm, quieter but stronger, the room beyond it waited, not for entertainment, not for resolution, but for truth. Because whatever came next would not just reveal who Claire was, it would reveal who Daniel had been all along. The kitchen no longer felt like Daniel's stage. It felt like a place being redefined in real time, not through words, not through authority, but through presence. Claire moved with the same quiet precision, but now every detail carried a clarity that even those without training could feel. The rhythm of her work was not rushed, not forced. It unfolded naturally, like something long practiced and deeply understood. She selected ingredients without hesitation, not from the most expensive options, but from the ones that made sense, the ones that aligned. And that choice alone shifted the perception of everyone watching, because it was not about display, it was about intention. Daniel stood just behind her, close enough to see the smallest movements. The way her fingers adjusted the heat without looking. The way she balanced flavors without measuring. And the more he watched, the more something inside him unsettled, because what he saw was not just skill, it was restraint, the kind he had not practiced in a long time, the kind that required letting go of the need to impress. The staff around them had stopped pretending to work, their attention fully drawn in, not by command, but by something far more powerful, recognition. Claire plated the dish slowly, deliberately, not as a performance, but as a conclusion, every element placed with purpose, no excess, no unnecessary flourish, just clarity. And when she finished, she did not announce it. She did not step forward to present it. She simply stepped back, leaving the plate where it belonged, as if it could speak for itself. Daniel hesitated for a moment before reaching for it, his hand pausing just slightly above the edge, a subtle hesitation that would have been unthinkable for him earlier that evening. But this was no longer earlier. This was something else, something he had not prepared for. He lifted the plate and turned toward the dining room. The shift in his posture almost imperceptible, but real, the confidence still there, but tempered, quieter, as if something inside him had recalibrated. The guests watched as he approached, their earlier expressions replaced by something more attentive, more careful. The critic remained seated, but his focus was absolute. Daniel placed the dish in front of him, this time without commentary, without framing the moment, and that silence alone spoke louder than anything he could have said. The critic examined the plate briefly, then took a bite. The room held its breath again, but this time, the anticipation felt different, not eager for a spectacle, but aware of significance. The critic closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in exaggeration, but in concentration, and when he opened them, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. He set the fork down and looked at Daniel, not past him, not through him, but directly at him. And in that gaze was something unmistakable, not judgment, not triumph, but truth. This, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the room without effort, is what you have been trying to recreate. The words landed with precision, cutting through the tension not with force, but with accuracy. Daniel did not respond immediately, because he could not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. The realization settled slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as something undeniable, something that had been there all along, just out of reach. The staff exchanged glances again, but this time there was no confusion, only confirmation. Claire remained in the kitchen, her presence steady, unchanged, not stepping forward, not claiming anything, and that absence from the spotlight only made her influence more visible. The critic continued, his tone measured. Technique can be learned, he said, but understanding cannot be imitated. And the room fell silent once more, not because they were waiting for a reaction, but because they had already received the answer. And in that stillness, Daniel stood at the center of a truth he could no longer avoid, one that did not diminish him, but revealed him, stripped of performance, stripped of control, leaving only what was real. And for the first time that night, that was more than enough. No one rushed to speak after the critic's words settled, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to defend, only something to understand, the kind of understanding that arrives quietly but changes everything it touches. Daniel remained standing beside the table, the plate now empty except for the trace of what had just been revealed. His eyes lowered for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in reflection, and when he looked up again, something had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that felt real, the kind of shift that does not perform itself for others. He turned slowly toward the kitchen, toward the place where Claire still stood, not waiting, not expecting anything, simply present, as she had been from the beginning. The staff parted slightly as he walked back, not out of fear, not out of command, but out of awareness that something meaningful was about to happen. The energy in the room had changed too much to pretend otherwise. Daniel stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that the distance between them was no longer about hierarchy, but about choice. He did not speak. Immediately, and that silence, coming from him, carried more weight than any statement he had made all evening. Claire met his gaze, steady as always, her expression unchanged, not guarded, not triumphant, just calm, as if the outcome of this moment had never been her concern. Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that steadies something deeper than words. "I thought I understood what this place needed," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been all night, but clearer, more deliberate. "But I have been trying to control something that is not meant to be controlled." The admission did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a quiet certainty that no one could ignore. A few of the staff exchanged glances, not in shock, but in recognition, because they felt it too. The difference between authority and understanding. Claire listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, and when he finished, she nodded slightly, not as approval, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement. And that simple gesture carried more weight than any applause could have. The critic remained at the table, watching, not as an outsider now, but as someone witnessing a moment that mattered beyond a single review, beyond a single evening. Daniel stepped back just slightly, not retreating, but creating space. And in that space, something new existed, something that had not been there before. Respect, not demanded, not enforced, but earned in the quietest way possible. Claire glanced once more toward the kitchen, then back at him, and without another word, she turned and returned to her station, the same place where she had begun, her movements returning to their steady rhythm, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, but softer now, more thoughtful. The laughter that had once filled the space replaced by something calmer, something more aware. Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching her, not as a superior, not as a rival, but as someone who had just been reminded of something he had almost forgotten. And then he turned back toward the dining room, not to reclaim attention, but to continue the work. Differently, the critic picked up his glass, his expression thoughtful, and for the first time that evening, he smiled, not at a performance, but at the absence of one, because what he had witnessed was not just skill, not just talent, but something far more rare,